War. Sometimes it is a war not fought with tanks or planes, but wars of thoughts, concepts, ideologies. But this type of war affects the environment we live in, the connections and relations we have, and its significance is undeniable. The Chinese Civil War was a conflict like this, and the outcome affected relations between Asia and Australia drastically, changing not only our point of view, but our society as a whole. The Chinese Civil War was an intermittent battle fought from 1927 to 1951 because of a difference in thinking and ideologies between the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and the Nationalist Kuomintang, KMT. The war was a fight for legitimacy as the government and rightful ruler of Greater China. They both claimed to be the rightful successor of Sun Yat-sen, a very popular Chinese revolutionary. Some people say the war has not ended, and the unrest of differing thoughts and opinions still exists today in the form of a spiteful rivalry between Taiwan and mainland China. Despite there being minor uprisings such as the May the 4th movement in 1911 and the Shanghai Communist Massacre in 1927, the war truly began on August 1, 1927, where Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang, besieged the communist-occupied Beijing and successfully took hold of the city, an act of war against the CCP. The whole world noticed this, but did not take action against this aggressive act, due to the rise of fascism and dictatorships in Europe. Nevertheless, nations were shocked at such an unexpected and brutal conflict. It is important to remember that at this point, mainland China was disunified and consisted of many clans and provinces, so the two opposing forces were always in close proximity to each other, making the war consistent and unresting. One country in particular took advantage of this unrest in China to expand their empire and resources, which particularly catalyzed the intensity of the conflicts in China, and who saw opportunities to conquer and rule over greater lands. This country was Japan. In 1931, through the staged Mukden incident, it led to a Japanese military occupation of Manchuria and the installation of a Japanese puppet regime. Because of the harsh occupation regime, where natives were stripped of their valuables, many countries failed to recognize Manchukuo as a foreign territory of Japan. Keep this in mind, as the vast resources in Manchuria would play a vital part in the Civil War. When Japan was defeated and relinquished its holdings in China through the Potsdam Declaration, it set off a race between the nationalists and communists to control vital resources and population centers in northern China and Manchuria. Nationalist troops, using transportation facilities in the US military, were able to take over key cities and railway lines in East and North China. Communist troops occupied much of the hinterland in the north and in Manchuria. The Chinese United Front had always been precarious, and it had been tacitly understood by both the nationalists and communists that they would cooperate only until Japan had been defeated. Until then, neither side could afford to seem to pursue internal aims at the cost of the national struggle. At the end of the Riza skirmish between the two parties, 1948 to 1949, due to the corruption of the Kuomintang leaders who took US money for their own interests, the fact that the Kuomintang did little for the collapsing Chinese economy, and the nationalist army was poorly trained and was no match for the well-trained Red Forces, the Kuomintang was eventually defeated and forced to flee to Taiwan as the CCP took hold of the mainland. However, the Kuomintang was not the only organization that was affected by the ideology and triumph of the CCP. In fact, it would change national relations to an entire continent for almost every country, and was undoubtedly one of the most significant events in modern history. Australia, a diverse and rich land. Australia is a Western nation most economically dependent on China. Yet the decline in its relations with China has become a paradigm for fraught relations with Beijing. The United States, European Union, and other Western governments have all condemned the latest incident of Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy towards Australia. The bilateral trading bonanza that fueled a quarter of a century without an economic recession has become, by Canberra's own description, a target for disruptive measures from Beijing, on a scale not experienced even by countries that have territorial disputes and difficult history with China, such as Taiwan and Japan. How did a nation that sells 40% of its exports to China, has 1.2 million ethnic Chinese citizens, in a population of some 25 million, end up in this situation? And what lessons does Australia experience hold for other citizens in their dealings with Beijing, and possibly the entire continent of Asia? Problems began to emerge in 1996, when China criticized Australia's policy on China and Taiwan, which it perceived was becoming too closely tied with US policy, and which it interpreted as throwing doubts on Australia's commitments to a one China policy. This perception grew out of the new Australian government's quick expression of the support for US actions in response to Chinese military exercises in the Taiwan Straits during the March 1996 Taiwanese presidential election, as well as the upgrading of Australia's defense ties with the US in July 1996. China also criticized the visit to Taiwan by the Primary Industries Minister, Mr. Anderson, and the discussion about the possibility of Australia selling uranium to Taiwan. Adding to the ill feeling was the decision by the Australian government in April 1996 to cut part of Australia's aid program to China. The Chinese government also condemned the action by the Prime Minister, Mr. John Howard, in meeting the Dalai Lama during the latter's visit to China. The growing importance of relations with China for Australian policymakers is set to continue because China is maintaining rapid economic growth even while entering a period of political uncertainty. International attention has focused even more on this uncertainty since the death of Deng Xiaoping. The Chinese economy has sustained an average annual growth rate of almost 10% over the last decade and is projected to become the world's second largest economy within the next 10 years. China's growth, together with Australia's greater relative economic involvement in the Asia-Pacific region, have led to a 20% average annual increase in Australia's exports to China over the last 5 years. China is currently Australia's fifth largest trading partner, and if the trade figures with Hong Kong were to be added after reunification in July 1997, the total would rank third after Japan and the US. The vigorous growth in the Chinese economy has continued to create opportunities for Australian investment in Chinese manufacturing, services, and primary industries. The Chinese investment in Australian agriculture and minerals has expanded considerably in recent years. China went through an extraordinary history of political convulsions from the First Revolution of 1911 through the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. Although the country is now making rapid progress towards economic modernization, it is yet to establish political institutions which do not depend crucially on the will and authority of a few key individuals. China is rapidly integrating into the world economy, but the state structures which made integration possible are slow to reform and adapt to the new Chinese society that economic change is creating. The Chinese government understandably expects that the country's emerging status as a leading world economy should be given due to recognition in global institutions and affairs. But some parts of the international community still consider that China does not conform fully to the established norms of international relations. For its part, the Chinese government, mindful of the fear and suspicion with which it is regarded in some quarters in the US and Australia, tends to interpret any pressure to reform its institutions and politics as a new form of anti-Chinese containment. Moreover, any policy or action by a foreign power which suggests a questioning of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, Hong Kong, or Taiwan is regarded as an act hostile to the interests of the entire Chinese nation and the world. Thank you.